So thanks for having me today to talk about flexible, accessible public transport. This is a topic that has been on my mind, well, for a very long time, but more recently, specifically been on my mind because of the Edinburgh Mobility Plan 2030. This is a draft document with a wide range of sustainable mobility goals, one of which is on this slide here. It calls for greater use of the public transport network through more flexible services with improved accessibility. So as soon as I read this, I started thinking about adaptable services that have reached a lot of people and achieved substantial use of the public transport network. So the first thing that came to mind was South Africa's minibus taxi network. This is very far-reaching public transport service in South Africa. These little minibus taxis, they seat up to 15 people, common sight across towns and cities in the region. And they are what you would call an informal type of public transport. So it could just be one person running a minibus taxi, or it could be a small group or even a large group of people working on their chunk of the service. And they may be running their business very formally, but because there's no government involvement, no government endorsement, no subsidy of any kind, it's known as an informal type of public transport. So it operates on a fixed destination, semi-fixed route basis. So what that means is that when you in the window, or somebody has called out the window where the bus is going, and the route varies. So the driver has the flexibility and the freedom to take the route that they choose. And this is based on the fact that this is a business. So the goal is to make as much money as possible. So the quickest route, or the route that picks up the most passengers, is the most profitable route. Now, the service connects outer to central areas. This is because during the apartheid era, non-white populations typically lived further out and worked more centrally, and there was no public transport provision to meet their mobility needs. So the minibus taxi network emerged as a mobility solution. And that spatial legacy is largely still in place in South Africa, so the same need exists. Now, because of the fact that it's a business, the frequency is highly variable to ensure that there's a profitable service to run. So during peak periods, there'll be loads of minibus taxis available, and then during off-peak periods, there is substantially less. Now, this obviously makes total business sense, but if you think about public transport as like a social good to improve people's quality of life, that's not so ideal. So what is the passenger experience like? Well, if you use public transport in South Africa, there is a strong chance that you will use a minibus taxi at least at some point. More than 2/3 of public transport trips happen in this mode. And your knowledge of the network is something that you basically gain over time. There's no centralized app, there's no website or anything because of the fact that it's an informal service. So you learn how to use the system, and if you need to take an unusual route that you may not have taken before, then you have to talk to somebody to find out what you need to do. You could expect varying levels of comfort and safety. There are minimum legal standards in place, but things like cleanliness, driving style, this obviously depends on the person who's running that van. And there's the occasional rogue trader operating a clapped out van that's below minimum legal standards. So as I'm hinting at here, there are some challenges in the system. And if Edinburgh or any city was looking to supplement their public transport with something that was a bit more flexible and accessible, you wouldn't want to do a copy paste of what they have in South Africa. There can be congestion at key points and at peak times. So for example, if you think about a city centre taxi rank during the morning rush hour, with all these minibus taxis converging on that at the same time, it can get congested. There's a financial model that motivates dangerous driving, similar to the criticism you see leveled at Uber drivers. Once you've got your passenger, that's your revenue until you get your next batch of passengers. So there's a reason to get the journey over and done with as quickly as possible. And the informal operational style can also introduce tension between drivers because two minibuses on the same road are effectively competing with each other. And there can also be tension between those who run or work in the informal sector and those who work in formal public transport. So for example, in both Johannesburg and Cape Town in the last 10 years or so, there's been a substantial amount of investment in bus rapid transit. So big, glossy European style buses with bus stops and separate bus lanes. And those have been extended outwards, often to townships, the informal housing areas. And those areas were historically served only by minibus taxis. So the government has emerged as a competitor, and they're playing by a different set of rules because they're not driven by profit. And this tension in both the cases I mentioned can occasionally spill over into violence. And for passengers, the lack of operational information can be a challenge. I think it's really easy to take for granted the fact that if you want to plan a route on public transport in Edinburgh or any sort of modern Western city, you've got so much information available to you on your phone. You can really quickly make judgment calls on what you want to do. If you're operating sort of an unusual transport schedule in your life, then the minibus taxi network can be challenging because you have to do a lot of complicated things, talking to different people to find out how to get where you need to be. Selling the idea in a way that works is really important. So if I was to try and persuade the people of Edinburgh that the solution for the mobility plan is a flexible, demand-based shared mobility system, probably turning to Africa as the sole example would be a mistake. We have a culture in the West of looking to the developing world cities as places that have problems that need to be solved, not so much as places that have some solutions for our problems. So a more Western example would, I think, be beneficial. So something like Uber Pool, which we're probably all familiar with, a shared Uber ride where you get picked up and dropped off where you want, but the route varies to pick up other passengers. Or in the middle here, BB1. This is no longer in operation, but this was a partnership between Citymapper and Get, which basically turned black cabs in London into 5-seater minibuses, where the route was fixed, but you could get on and off wherever you wanted. And on the right here, Book a Bus. This is a full-size bus that runs in rural Wales. It's bookable service, and the route is fully flexible based on who has booked the service. So I would argue then that the opportunity for Edinburgh or any city looking for a flexible, accessible addition to its public transport is for a minibus-style service that's integrated within the existing network. Something that runs on flexible routes with a fixed start and end point, but potentially has also fixed midpoints. A route with fixed midpoints could be hailed at those points, and the service would also be bookable, allowing people to be picked up from a specific location. This would improve the accessibility, both in terms of reaching people that the network doesn't currently reach, but if vehicles were accessible as well, physically accessible, then somebody who's unable to access the current public transport system could be served by this method. And it could operate like a feeder, running people to train, tram, bus stops, but it could also operate standalone routes, including potentially radial routes, which are often requested, but we're told they aren't possible because the demand isn't there. Well, a smaller vehicle would be ideal for this. And this could therefore also offer the opportunity for prototyping a service of a larger scale, a more permanent nature, by understanding how people use a more flexible service. And so I would argue that a system like this could help Edinburgh achieve its mobility plan goal. And that's me. Thank you.